before the eyes of royalty, dignitaries, and the watching world, a royal guard was humiliated, not for failing his duty, not for breaking tradition, but for something far older and crueler. In a courtyard meant to celebrate loyalty and honor, he became the target of a cruelty that had no place among the banners and marble. The insult cut through the sacred ceremony like a hidden dagger, leaving a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air itself. For 3 long hours he stood there, unmoving, unflinching, while whispers traveled like poison among the crowd. But when the queen finally rose to make her decision, it wasn't just a moment of protocol. It was a reckoning, and the entire nation stood still to witness what true justice looked like. Before we reveal how dignity turned the tide of history, how one man's silent strength rewrote the ending of a day meant to break him, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And stay with us, because this story proves that real honor can never be stolen. Not by mockery, not by silence, and not by those who fear the strength they cannot understand. Corporal James Whittaker knew the meaning of silent battles long before he ever stood guard at a palace gate. Raised in the narrow streets of Manchester's working-class neighborhoods, he learned early that dignity wasn't stitched into the fabric of your birth. It was something you built, thread by patient thread. Every day you chose to stand when it would have been easier to walk away. His parents taught him the old ways, that loyalty mattered, that hard work was its own reward, and that true honor needed no audience. At 19, James had joined the Royal Guard, driven not by dreams of grandeur, but by a quiet promise he made to himself, to prove, in a world still hesitant to make room for men like him, that worth was measured by discipline, not by lineage. 10 years later, his record was a testament to that promise: impeccable service, countless ceremonies, winters endured in frozen silence, summers survived under merciless sun, every parade a silent march against the invisible weight of doubt. And yet, no matter how straight he stood or how brightly his boots shined, there was always an undercurrent he could feel but never name. The unspoken reminder that some eyes still measured him differently. It wasn't enough to be good. He had to be perfect, always. When word came that he had been selected for a rare ceremonial honor, a position few guards ever achieved, a place in the Queen's most prestigious public ceremony, he felt not pride, but a solemn gravity. This wasn't just for him. This was for every boy who had ever been told without words that they didn't belong. For every unseen man who had worn a uniform before the world was ready to see him. On the morning of the ceremony, as he adjusted the brilliant red of his tunic, brushed a final speck of dust from the polished black of his boots, and tightened the strap beneath his bearskin helmet, James didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood a little taller, ready to bear not just the weight of tradition, but the silent burden of history. He didn't know yet that by the day's end, the real honor he would carry wouldn't be in a title or a medal. It would be in the way he endured what no one else dared to confront. The royal courtyard gleamed beneath a high, forgiving sun, its marble floors polished to a mirror's gleam that reflected the banners swaying gently above. Red, gold, and deep blue flags framed the great stone archways, their colors rippling in the crisp spring breeze. Beneath their shadows, the grand stage had been set. Rows of dignitaries in tailored coats and ceremonial sashes, aristocrats adorned in jewels older than memory, and high-ranking officers whose medals flashed like stars against dark velvet uniforms. It was a day carved for spectacle, a celebration of service, of loyalty, of the enduring strength of tradition. Every polished shoe, every gleaming saber, every whisper between officials seemed rehearsed, as though history itself demanded perfection. Among the ranks of the Queen's Guard, standing straighter than the stone columns that lined the courtyard, was Corporal James Whittaker. His red tunic burned like a beacon against the sea of black and gold, the crisp white belt tight at his waist, the black trousers razor-sharp against polished boots. In his right hand, his ceremonial pike stood rooted to the ground, unmoving even as the breeze tugged at the hem of his coat. His black bearskin helmet, heavy and hot under the sun, pressed down like a crown not yet recognized. To those watching from the balconies, he was just another guard in a perfect line of tradition, but to some, those who still clung to old, brittle ideas, his very presence was a crack in the marble, a reminder that the world outside these ancient walls was changing faster than they could bear. James felt it, not in any one glance or whispered word, but in the subtle shift of the air around him. The way some dignitaries' smiles thinned slightly as they passed, the way a few heads turned a beat too long, not in admiration, but in quiet questioning. He stood through it all, his face an unbreakable mask of duty, not because he didn't notice, but because he knew the unspoken truth. This day was not just a test of tradition, it was a test of him, and somewhere deep within the grand beauty of the courtyard, beneath the soaring hymns, beneath the ceremonial trumpets, tension coiled like a wire stretched too thin. It should have been a day of celebration. It would become something else entirely. It happened just as the final medals were being readied for presentation. The royal trumpets had fallen silent. The crowd had shifted expectantly, the golden afternoon hovering on the edge of applause, and then a voice, sharp and heavy with bitterness, sliced through the sacred air. "They'll let anyone guard the Queen these days, won't they?" The words struck like a slap against the polished marble, raw and ugly against the hush of reverence. Heads turned sharply toward the voice. An aging man, medals clinking across his chest, his chin tilted in the smug defiance of someone who had long mistaken cruelty for wit. A retired officer, once respected, now clinging to the crumbling weight of old prejudices. For a terrible heartbeat, the courtyard was paralyzed. A few nervous chuckles rippled from the far side of the gathering, thin, brittle sounds quickly smothered under the furious glares of younger officers. Yet even those glares, even the silent recoiling of polite society, couldn't undo the damage. The insult had already been hurled. The stain had already spread. Officials shifted uncomfortably. Some looked to the Queen's private secretary with uncertain glances. Others stared fixedly ahead, pretending not to have heard, burying themselves in the ritual of ceremony, rather than face the rot that had surfaced among them. And in the center of it all, at the tip of every burning stair, stood Corporal James Whittaker. He did not flinch. He did not break formation. He did not so much as blink. The ceremonial pike remained rooted against the marble, the polished steel catching the afternoon light. His face, a mask carved from the same stone as the palace walls, betrayed no emotion. But inside where no hymn could reach, a fire raged so fierce it threatened to crack the very silence he wore like armor. He could have spoken. He could have turned. He could have shattered the brittle veneer of respectability with a single word. But he didn't. Because James Whittaker understood something deeper than the man who had insulted him would ever grasp. True strength did not always roar. Sometimes it stood still, unshaken, unbroken. The ceremony stumbled onward, the Queen's officials scrambling to restore the crumbling decorum. The names were called, the medals awarded, the courtiers bowed and curtsied as tradition demanded. But beneath the surface, Beneath the smiles and the formal handshakes, the day had already changed. A wound had been opened in the marble halls of history, and, though the world would pretend not to see it, those who had witnessed it would never forget. And neither would James. The ceremony stumbled forward as if nothing had happened. The speeches resumed. The formalities continued. The ancient rituals unfolded beneath the flags, still snapping smartly in the breeze. Photographers lifted their cameras. Musicians lifted their instruments. And all around, the great and the good of the kingdom did what they had been trained to do: pretend. Pretend that ugliness had not cracked through the marble. Pretend that no insult had been spoken. Pretend that the cost of silence was not being measured by the man standing at the center of it all. For 3 long hours, Corporal James Whittaker remained rooted to his place, a statue carved not of stone, but of flesh and will. He could feel it. The way glances bounced off him like stones skipped across a frozen lake. The way conversations lowered and flickered at the edges of the courtyard. The way a few of the old guard stiffened when they passed him, their faces set into masks too brittle to hide the truth. Not a single apology came. Not a single word of defense. Not from the men who had once called him brother-in-arms, nor from the officers whose duty it was to shield their own. The weight of tradition was a convenient shield, one they chose now to hide behind, rather than wield in protection. James felt every second drag against his skin like a grinding stone. His body ached with the unrelenting discipline demanded of him. His mind screamed against the injustice that no one else would name. Inside, the battle raged. Speak, and risk being branded the troublemaker, the man who brought shame upon a sacred ceremony, or remain silent and wonder if dignity meant anything when no one seemed willing to defend it. He could have stepped out of line. He could have thrown down his pike and made them see him, not as a uniform, not as a symbol, but as a man who deserved better. But something deeper held him in place, something old and stubborn and proud, stitched into him long before he ever wore a uniform. James chose the harder path. He chose to trust that silent dignity could survive even when unseen, that sometimes the strongest stand a man could take was to remain standing when the world turned its head away. The hours passed like lifetimes. The sun dipped lower against the courtyard walls, and still James stood, unmoving, unyielding, waiting for a justice he could not demand, but would not abandon. When the last anthem faded into the cooling air and the crowd began to drift away from the courtyard, believing the day was done, the true ceremony had only just begun behind closed doors. Within the deep, stone-clad halls of the palace, a private meeting was called, swift, decisive, and absolute. Only a handful of officials were summoned, only those who mattered. And at the center of it all, a simple directive was handed down, carried by the Queen's private secretary, with the full weight of royal authority behind every word. The retired officer, the one who had turned sacred air into ash, was to be stripped of all ceremonial privileges, effective immediately. His name, once whispered with casual reverence among the old guard, would no longer be spoken in the halls of honor, his invitations rescinded, his medals tarnished not by time, but by his own hand, his legacy reduced not by anger, but by silent, deliberate consequence. But there was more. Corporal James Whittaker, the man who had stood against the tide without lifting a voice or a hand, was to be honored, personally, directly. An invitation was dispatched, not a request, but a royal command. James was to present himself the following morning in the Queen's private reception room, alongside select members of the royal staff and a few key witnesses to the day's shameful incident. including, by pointed royal design, some of those who had laughed. When James entered the quiet, sunlit chamber the next day, he found no crowd, no trumpets, no parade. Only the Queen herself, standing in quiet dignity, her eyes steady, her expression carved with the calm weight of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize true strength when it stood before her. Without fanfare, without ceremony, she spoke. She spoke not of tradition, nor of medals, nor of bloodlines or ancient titles. She spoke of dignity, of restraint, of the kind of courage that required no weapon, no shield, only the unbreakable will to remain standing when others would have crumbled. Before all present, she presented James with a personal commendation, a royal medal reserved not for acts of war, but for acts of unshakable moral bravery. When the small medallion was pinned to his tunic, the room did not erupt into applause. It didn't need to. The silence itself, the very silence that had once tried to shame him, now stood transformed, heavy, reverent, humbled. In that moment, the laughter of the previous day was erased, not by anger, not by revenge, but by the unassailable, towering dignity of a man who had refused to let cruelty define him. Days later, beneath the dappled shade of the palace gardens, where sunlight filtered through ancient oaks and the air smelled faintly of lavender and stone, a small ceremony was held. No photographers, no flashing lights, no swelling music to announce the moment. Just the quiet gathering of those who understood what had truly been tested, and who had borne witness to the quiet triumph that followed. Corporal James Whittaker stood once again in full ceremonial dress, but this time there was no need for rigid silence or hidden pain. In the soft rustle of the garden breeze, in the stillness of those gathered around him, there was a reverence deeper than tradition, a reverence for the man, not just the uniform. The Queen's private secretary stepped forward, bearing a simple velvet box. Inside rested a medal rarely given, reserved for those who embodied not just service, but a higher calling, the preservation of dignity in the face of injustice, for exemplary service and silent strength. The inscription read. As the medal was pinned to his chest, James bowed his head, not out of submission, but out of a profound understanding that some victories are quiet and some crowns are invisible. Later, when the ceremony ended and the courtiers drifted away, a new plaque was mounted inside the Royal Guard's Hall of Honor. The oak was freshly polished, the engraving crisp and deliberate. It did not recount the insult. It did not name the fallen. It spoke only the truth that mattered. True honor stands even when the world looks away. And beneath those words in simple, timeless letters was inscribed the name, Corporal James Whittaker. As James stood alone before the plaque, the weight of 1,000 invisible battles resting quietly on his shoulders, he allowed himself a rare, small smile. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded his place. He had simply stood, and in doing so he had rewritten what it meant to wear the colors of a crown. The world outside might forget, but the walls of that hall, the stones of that palace, would remember. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that never speaks. Sometimes true justice doesn't roar. It rises quietly but unmistakably, built not from anger or revenge, but from the steady, unbreakable courage to simply stand tall when the world demands you bow. In a world too often deafened by noise, it is the silent strength that leaves the deepest echoes. Corporal James Whittaker didn't need to shout to change history. He only needed to remain unshaken. And in doing so, he reminded all who watched that true honor can never be stolen by cruelty. It can only be made greater. Have you ever stood your ground without saying a word? Have you ever trusted silent dignity to speak louder than injustice? Share your story in the comments below, and stay with us for more powerful moments where quiet strength shapes the future and dignity changes history.